All right. So we are in the book of Ecclesiastes for one last time. And thank you. You guys have been most gracious and most kind. And it has been an absolute pleasure to be with you guys. And I get to teach through Ecclesiastes, which is just good. And so we are here in Ecclesiastes. And last week, when we looked at the book of Ecclesiastes, we kind of did a summary of what the book was about. By summary, I mean I went from chapter 1 to chapter 12 and skipped the entire middle. So tonight, I'm hoping to get the entire middle. This morning, we looked at the idea of what happens when you choose not to follow your guide. And we went pretty much everywhere else in Scripture. Preached about 3 sermons, sorry. And so, Lord willing, that was helpful to put all that together. Tonight, I simply want to look at something, and what is the main message Solomon is trying to present? Where is Solomon leading us? What is Solomon trying to teach us through the book of Ecclesiastes? And that's where I want to go tonight, Lord willing. So if you're in Ecclesiastes, we are actually going to start off in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, just really quickly review. And then I want to look at some of the things that Solomon is teaching us. But before we get there, let's open in prayer, and then we will look at where Solomon's leading us. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day. I thank you for this church. I thank you for their faithfulness through the years, and I just pray you'd continue to bless them. I pray for Pastor Ed. I pray that you just continue to give him rest with the finishing up of his vacation, and I just pray that he'd be encouraged in the ministry. And I just thank you for those who've been such an encouragement to me in these just few times I've met him. Thank you, Lord, and I pray all this in your name. Amen. So we are looking at this idea of where Solomon's leading us, and obviously we get into Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and just some of the passages here. And as we talked, specifically we'll get into verse 12. It says, I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. And I gave my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail hath God given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith. I have seen the works which are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. I commune with mine heart, saying, Lo, I am come of great estate. I have gotten more wisdom than all they that were before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had great remembrance of wisdom and knowledge, and I gave my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is vexation of spirit. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. I said in my heart, Go to now, I will prove thee with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. And behold, this is also vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it? I sought in my heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting myself with wisdom, to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men, which they should do under the heavens all the days of their life. I made me great works, I builded me houses, I planted me vineyards, I made me gardens and orchards, and I planted trees in them of all kinds of fruit. I made me pools of water, to water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. I got me servants and maidens, and had servants born in my house. Also I had great possession of great and small cattle, above all that were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered me silver and gold, and the peculiar treasure of kings of the provinces. I gat me men singers and women singers, the delights of the sons of men, as musical instruments, and that of all sorts. So I was great, and increased more than all they that were before me in Jerusalem, and also my wisdom remained with me. And whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all of my labor, and this was the portion of all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on all the labor that I had labored to do. And behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. And then I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly. For what can a man do that cometh after the king, even that which is already done? And I saw that wisdom excelleth folly, as far as light excelleth darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walketh in darkness. And I myself perceived also that one event happeneth to them all. I'm going to pause there, because right there we get hinted at the first stop that Solomon is trying to lead us to. It's not quite so obvious just by that reading. But what Solomon is talking about in this passage is he's talking about the one event that will affect every single one of us eventually. It's death. And so Solomon, throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, is going to constantly, he's going to say, let's talk about life. Let's talk about all this stuff. It all boils down, and at the end of the road, everyone is equalized. At the end of the road, it all comes down to one thing, and that's death. And so Solomon, the first warning or the first admonition, the first thing he wants us to remember is that there is an end to the road, and you have to pay attention to where that road is going to end. I love C.T. Studd. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the life of C.T. Studd. He was a man who was a very successful athlete. I believe cricket was his sport of choice. Extremely well known, extremely rich, extremely famous, and he chose to give it all up to go become a missionary. And C.T. Studd wrote a poem that you might know part of, but he wrote a poem, and I'm going to read the whole thing to you, because I think it's powerful enough, and it drives home this point that Solomon is driving home as well. And remember, this is a guy who gave up everything to go become a missionary. And people just marveled at it, and they're like, why? Why would you do this? And he says this, traveling along life's busy way, 2 little lines I heard one day, bringing conviction to my heart, and from my mind would not depart. Only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. Only one life, yea, yes, only one. Soon will its fleeting hours be done. Then in that day my Lord will meet and stand before his judgment seat. Only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. Only one life, the still small voice gently pleads for a better choice, bidding me selfish aims to leave and to God's holy will to cleave. Only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. Only one life, a few brief years, each with its burdens, hopes, and fears, each with its clays I must fulfill, living for self or in his will. Only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. When this bright world would tempt me sore, when Satan would a victory score, when self would seek to have its way, then help me, Lord, with joy to say, only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. Give me, Father, a purpose deep, in joy or sorrow, thy word to keep, faithful and true, whate'er the strife, pleasing thee in my daily life. Only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. Only let my love with fervor burn, and from the world now let me turn, living for thee and thee alone, bringing thee pleasure on thy throne. Only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. Only one life, yes, only one. Now let me say, thy will be done. And when at last I'll hear the call, I know I'll say 'twas worth it all. Only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. Only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. And when I am dying, how happy I'll be if the lamp of my life has been burnt out for thee. And here's a guy who gave it all up. He gave up everything and said, I am willing to put it all on the line for Christ and his kingdom. And I'm going to just be faithful. And that's what Solomon's saying. Solomon is saying we need to live in light of death. I could go through passage after passage after passage, but you will, when you read through Ecclesiastes, you will start noticing over and over and over, he will constantly bring up death. And in fact, if you go to Ecclesiastes chapter 12, where we've spent extensive amounts of time already, the entire first 8 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 12 is a really long, extended poem about old age and death. It's rather depressing, but it's a beautiful poem, but rather depressing. And so he says this, remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. And then what he starts to do throughout the rest of this poem is he starts to use imagery for your eyesight going, your teeth going, your body going. I don't need to belabor the point. You know what I'm talking about. But he says, while the sun or the light or the moon or the stars be not darkened, and the clouds return after the rain, in the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves. And I love this one because I've lived this the last few years. The grinders cease because they are few. You know, and your teeth start to break, you're like, oh man, I really should have appreciated those when I had them. But then he goes on and he says, and those that look out the windows be darkened. And again, it's a very beautiful poem, but he's just bringing attention to the fact of live for God while you still have life. Serve God while you still have life. Remember him while you still have life. And now I understand. I'm talking to a group of mostly not young people anymore. So you look at a passage like this and you're like, well, my days of my youth, yeah, time travel. Okay, you're still alive. There's still service to be done. I know one of the greatest encouragements I have is to have people, hey, they're praying for me. There's still service. There's still things that can be done. And so I know there's a lot of times where you look at that and say, well, I'm not the youth anymore. When you talk about the silver cord, I've got a few of those. I know what you're talking about. The grinders cease because they are few. I get what you're talking about. But I think the special challenge here is what we saw last week in verse 10, where he talks about, hey, I set things in order for the next generation. I sought out acceptable words, and I wrote them down, and I made sure the next generation knows. Because I think, like I said, Solomon is that perfect example of a man who from experience could say, this is how you should live. I've experienced this. And it's a beauty of taking someone younger under wing and saying, let me teach you a thing. You might not want to say that. You might want to do that. You might not want to live that way. I understand. And that's the idea of living in light of eternity. Living in light of the fact of death is coming and you don't have all the time in the world. I think it's a really beautiful passage and we'll get into it, but if you remember the old group, the Byrds, they wrote a song called Turn, Turn, Turn. I got to point this one out. We'll get into it in just a sec. But look at Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Look at this. And they pulled literally from this passage. Like word for word, exactly from this passage, except for the turn, turn, turn. That's not in there. But I want you to notice it because what he's saying is, to everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. And you can read the rest, but what he's doing is he's talking about all these different times. But you notice one of the first ones there is a time to be born and a time to die. And so Solomon will repeatedly bring this up throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. And so the first thing Solomon is leading us to is to live in light of eternity, to live in light of the incoming death, not in a depressive sense, but using that as a motivation to say, I'm not going to waste any of the time. I mean, I love the passage that says, redeeming the time because the days are evil. If you knew, like, tomorrow was my last day, what would you have to set in order? And that's the idea where it's like, we're not promised any more time. We don't know. And as you're living in light of that eternity, you make it last. You make it meaningful. The second thing he's leading us to is hinted at also in that passage I just read. And it's understanding God's sovereignty over our situation. As you read that passage that I just read in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, you will notice that a lot of things on that list you have absolutely no control over. The day to be born. We were joking about the birthday today and like, how come you chose to be born on October 31st? Come on now. It's a joke because even your parents, they didn't choose. Even, they got a C-section. Okay, yeah, maybe. But the reality is, when my son was born, we waited and waited and waited, and they said, like, well, he's going to be born between these ranges of dates because they didn't know quite for sure. Well, he was born a day after the last day they told us because he just wouldn't come out. And they finally had to just, all right, we're cutting you out of there. And they had to do a C-section and pull him out because he would not come. And so we think, we have this idea of, I got control over this situation, but we really don't. Even things like a time to plant and a time to pluck up. Yes, you can plant whenever you want to, but it doesn't mean it's going to grow. We have seasons, and it says, this is the time to plant. And guess what? When you plant it, this is the time to harvest. And you can choose like the few days on either side of that window, but you can't suddenly decide, well, I don't want the pumpkin to grow at this time. I want it to grow then. And it's like, that's not how that works unless you have a greenhouse. And so what he's doing is he's showing a range of activities and saying, I'm sorry, some of these you have a little bit of control over, but for most of these, you don't have any control over. And look at this, because what he does in verse 9 of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, he says, all right, so since God has kind of set a time for all these things, what profit hath a man that worketh in that wherein he laboureth? I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. But look at verse 11. He hath made everything beautiful in his time. And I think that's a beautiful passage to understand. I know working at camp over the years, there have been all sorts of things that I have tried and completely failed at. Even before I worked at camp, I mean, I published 2 books and they completely flopped, and my publisher shut down. That was encouraging. But it wasn't my fault. That was not me. They were a bunch of thieves, and that's partly why everything happened the way it did. But there's a level of understanding that God is in control. God will work. And yes, there are times where we could look and say, well, I should have done that better, and I should have done that, and I shouldn't have done that. But one of the things that I find amazing, and I've actually done a whole study through Ecclesiastes with this, if you study out the concept of luck in the Bible, because Solomon will keep talking about this thing, and he'll say, time and chance happeneth to them all. And if you think about, kind of the rolling of the dice, and the Bible talks about, the lot is cast out of the bag, but the dispersing of it is of the Lord. And it's this idea where throughout the Bible, men would use certain chance activities to try to figure out God's will. Why? Because if you study out the concept of luck, and if you study out the concept of happened, like it just happened to be this way, you know what you find? All luck is God working behind the scenes, and you don't see his hand. You see all of his actions, but you don't see him directly. A perfect, entire book-long study in this is the book of Esther. And if you study out the book of Esther, situation after situation after situation is just so happened to work out that way. But you know what is weird about the book of Esther? God's name is not mentioned once. It's a perfect example of luck. Because what it is God is saying, I'm going to work behind the scenes. You're going to see my fingerprints. My presence is going to scream off the page. But I'm not going to let you see my actual name show up at all. And so it just so happened that Mordecai was standing where he was. And it just so happened that the king was tired but couldn't sleep. And so he just so happened to have this journal read to him. And it just so happened that he read about Mordecai and thought, wonder if that guy ever got rewarded. And then Haman just so happened to show up. And they just so happened to find the gallows that morning. Over and over and over. It's just happened. But we know the backstory. We're looking at that going, no, that's God sliding pieces expertly around the board. Unbelievable to watch. And that's why we have a passage like, God makes everything beautiful in his time. I love the rest of this verse here in Ecclesiastes 3:11, where he says, also, he has set the world in their heart. And the illustration I want you to think of when you see that passage is, imagine peering through a pinhole into a room. And you're looking through that little tiny pinhole and you're trying to make sense of what's in the room. And someone's describing to you what's in the room because they're in the room. And you're like, I don't see that. I don't see that at all. And you're looking through that itty bitty pinprick going, are you sure? You're saying there's not. And you're like, no, I'm in the room. I'm telling you what's in this room. And you're looking through that little pinhole going, I don't see it. And when it says that God has put eternity in their hearts, that's the illustration, because what he's doing is he's saying, there's so much, and we're looking through a pinhole of a pinhole of a pinhole, and we're seeing this narrow little band and going, I don't understand what God's doing. And God's like, it's okay. Like we said this morning, trust me. Because and if you don't quite understand that, look at the rest of the passage and you'll see. It says, he has set the world in their hearts so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from beginning to the end. And what it's saying is, God is so sovereign. He's so in control. He's so masterful at what he does. that sometimes he intentionally puts us in a spot where we're off balance just to remind us that he's in charge and to get us to trust him. And so Solomon throughout this is going to keep going and saying, you need to trust God. You need to serve him. You need to remember him and live like that. But understand that there are going to be things that God puts in the mind that says, you're not going to grasp this. You're not going to see the full scale of all that's going on. And he wants us to remember his sovereignty. And we don't understand why is this a time to kill and this is a time to be peaceful? Why is this a time for, why does it work that way? He makes everything beautiful in his time. He sets the time. He sets the boundaries. He does things for a reason. And again, you see that throughout history where God works that way. And so our first focus really is that understanding of the end of the road. The end of the road is God saying, there will come a day of death, and we need to understand that and live in light of it. The second point, as I just said, God will intentionally make some things hard to understand, so we have to trust his sovereignty. We have to understand and trust his control over the situation. The next point I think Solomon is leading us to is this. It kind of goes along with the other two, but we need to make God our focus. We did that this morning. We spent a lot of time in Isaiah 40 on purpose to really dig into saying, this is the God we serve. This is the greatness of the God we serve. This is his wisdom. This is the fact that he doesn't need a counselor. He doesn't need me to come along and tell him how to do things. He's far wiser than that. I know it sounds flippant, but God is a genius. Okay, I like to say that because the intellectual level of God is unbelievable. And if we believe that, then he really should be our focus, and he should be someone we look at. And so what I want to do really quick is I want to look at some of the stuff that is going to distract us from following God. Because what Solomon is going to do throughout the book of Ecclesiastes is he's going to bring up a bunch of stuff that distracted him from following God. The biggest one right off the bat would be in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 11. And I think if I just use a term for it, it's just stuff. Stuff is a distraction. Solomon lived that. I mean, we saw that in the text we read earlier, where he's just over and over and over again talking about all the stuff that he had and saying, it's all vanity and vexation of spirit. But I like this one because verse 10 specifically, he says, he that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver. He that loveth abundance with increase. This is also vanity. And so he's saying right off the bat that if you're someone who just loves the stuff, you're not going to be happy once you get it. And that's, if you think specifically talking to youngsters and teenagers and things like that, it's that type of idea that we have to nail into them and then remind ourselves about it. Because I don't know if I shared this story with you. I've taught through Ecclesiastes enough times, I forget sometimes what I've said. But I was teaching through this for a solid year. And I still remember driving in the bus and my mind's wandering and I'm going, if I just had a little bit more money, I think I'd be happy. I had enough. I really did. I had enough to live comfortably. I had enough to save. But my mind still wandered back to the old thing to say, if I just had more. And that's why Proverbs has some of those wonderful passages like, if you're someone who is given to appetite and you sit to eat with a ruler, put a knife to your throat. And you're like, what? And what he's saying is, it's better to take your own life than to give in to your own desire. Because you know what it is. It's, well, I could compromise and I could get a lot from this guy. And that's why he says it's better to take a knife to your throat than to sit down if you're someone who's given to appetite. And you're like, that's really serious. And it's because stuff is a distraction. I mean, I like the next verses. Verse 11, it says, when goods increased, they are increased that eat them. And what good is there to the owners thereof, saving the beholding of them with their eyes? And, he's bringing up just very practically, he's talked about the precious substance and the interesting treasures of kings. And so Solomon, of all people, would know what it's like to have stuff that is useless except just to look at. And so he's bringing up that point to say, guys, when it comes down to really cool stuff that is really fun to look at, I have it. But it is pretty much useless beyond that. I love my collectibles. But really, what are they good for? Except just looking at. And he's at least realistic enough to say, that's pretty much all they're good for. Now, he's not saying it's wrong to have collectibles, but he's saying if you live for it, ultimately at the end of your life, you're going to look at it and go, why do I have that? Ugh. And I couldn't help but be reminded when I worked at Ironwood. So Ironwood is this camp down in the desert. Basically, you'll leave Barstow and head toward Vegas, and out in the middle of nowhere, you'll run into this pretty big camp. And back when I was there in 2008, I believe it was, someone had died, and their children had inherited their entire animal collection. We're talking whole mount deers, deer, whatever, singular and plural, whole mount deer, elk, rabbits, antlers. I mean, just taxidermy heaven if you're into that stuff. And so imagine a U-Haul trailer of sorts rolling up to camp and saying, do you want these thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars worth of stuff? Well, of course they did. And so it was the challenge was on to find a place to put all this stuff. And so it's like antlers on the wall here. There could be a coat rack. And we'll put this animal here. And this, just packed to the nines with animals. In fact, the men's restroom in the office, you walk into it and you don't see it from the entrance. But when you're turning around to leave, there is a whole mounted, I believe it's an elk. It might be like a mule deer or something. And it's staring at you. It's just there in the middle of the bathroom, in the guy's bathroom, and you go to walk out and you're like, what is? There's a full deer staring at me. Wow. The reason I bring this up, though, because it plays a role in this illustration. Imagine the man who collected all that. Imagine the man who put in all that time and effort and money to hunt those deer and mount them, and he had them all around wherever he lived, which must have been a huge place. And then he dies. And he passes them on to his children. And his children look at them and go, no thanks. No thanks. Now, I am sure, or at least I'm hopeful, that wasn't all that man lived for. I'm hopeful that wasn't all that man passed down to his children. But imagine the life if that is all he passed on to his children, and his children looked at it and said, no thanks. No thanks. And no wonder Solomon could look at something like this and say, it's useless. It's vanity. It's empty. Because he talks about that idea. Throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, he'll talk about this idea of, I have given up so much to earn all this, and I'm going to die. And someone who has not earned it is going to inherit it all. And I don't know whether they're going to be a good man or not. And that really bothered Solomon. And he said, I don't know. And yet, there were times where he almost had a little bit more lucidity, and he says, but there is a wicked man over here who he's reaping up. And guess what? I know that God's going to work it out, that goes to the just man. God's going to work that out. But in his moments, Solomon would look at that and go, oof. I have given up so much joy. I have done so much to earn this. And yet at the end of my life, and you know who Solomon's son, you know how they turned out. It was pretty bad. And so that's the first thing. As we keep God our focus, we need to understand that there are going to be distractions along the path that are going to draw our eye away, and stuff is one of them. I think discouragement is another one. Discouragement. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter 11. Ecclesiastes chapter 11. And specifically, he's talking to young men. But I think it's something that we all can learn from. Because what he's going to do is he's going to say, it is not wrong to enjoy life. It is not wrong to say, God has given me the ability to enjoy what I have. I'm going to enjoy it. Now, throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, he's going to teach that is not what we live for, but if we have it, it's okay to enjoy it. It's similar to what the Apostle Paul will do. He says, those of you who are servants and you have the ability to be free, take it. That's okay. But if God has worked such in your life that you are stuck being a servant, then be content. And then I think that's a beautiful illustration, because sometimes we feel bad about enjoying what God has given us. Oh, I don't feel like I can actually, I don't. No, he's given us that ability. And so what he's looking at, young men, verse 9 of Ecclesiastes 11, rejoice, O young man, in thy youth, and let thine heart cheer thee in the day of thy youth. And this is where you've got to take Ecclesiastes in its context, because this is a very dangerous verse if you forget the last half of it. He says, and walk in the ways of thine heart and in the sight of thine eyes. Okay, got to be careful, because he's not saying just live however you want. Look at the rest. But know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment. Therefore remove sorrow from thy heart, put away evil from thy flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity. And so what he's doing is he's kind of drawing attention to the fact of enjoy. You don't have to spend all your time moping over the bad stuff. He will encourage us to remember the dark times and to remember the bitter moments, so to speak. But we don't have to just sit there and stew. We actually do have a lot to be joyous over. We have a lot to be thankful for. We have a lot to be extremely happy about. And so I think discouragement can be a distraction, because it leads to that spiral of I just can't get out of this. And so being thankful and remembering what God has done, I think, is an extremely powerful lesson. And discouragement can be just as much of a distraction as other things. Another point he'll make here through the book of Ecclesiastes, I like this one, Ecclesiastes 6:9. I think dreams can be a distraction. Ecclesiastes 6:9, I like this one. He says, better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. Solomon just has a way of writing that's fascinating. I love the way he puts it. You can tell he put a lot of work. And I know God inspired it and such, but you look at the different way the different writers wrote, and some of them are definitely more practiced. And Solomon is one of these guys who you can tell he knew how to turn a phrase. You can tell he knew how to make a proverb that was memorable. And I think it's powerful because you look at this and he says, better is the sight of the eyes. Better is what you have. Better is what you can see right in front of you than the wandering of desire. And I think this is important not only for us, but to teach to the next generation. Because there are a lot of times where it's like, be content. Be satisfied with what God has given. And that again, could be in the realm of finances, could be in the realm of relationships, could be all sorts of things. I mean, we deal with campers and the weird things that campers bring up, and even college students. When I worked with college students, where it's like, well, I want to be in a relationship, I want this, I want that, and it's like, be content with where God has you. Be content with what God has chosen to say, now this can be in your life. And so there was a time where my wife and I couldn't have kids. Obviously, we wanted to have kids, and we succeeded quite drastically. We succeeded. 4 kids later, okay, success, nailed it. But if you're in that state, be content. And that goes back to what I said with Paul, where he says, hey, if you're a servant and you can stay a servant, then okay. And if you have the ability to be free of that, okay. But Paul would say, I know how to be abased, and I know how to suffer need, I know how to prosper. He's like, I have learned in every state there would be content. Because again, to go back to our previous point, you understand the sovereignty of God. You understand the timing of God. And you just keep doing the right thing, again, to bring together all the points so far. And so that's why I think something like dreams can be a distraction. Because better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desires. Ecclesiastes 11:1 will bring up things. I think carefulness can be a distraction. That sounds weird, but look at Ecclesiastes 11:1. He talks here. I'm sure you've met those people who God challenges them to give, or God challenges them to make sacrifices for Him, and they're like, well, I don't know if I can. I've got these other obligations, and I don't know if I can do this. And so what Solomon would do is he'd look at someone like that and he'd say, what is it? How much is God worth to you? How much is serving God worth to you? And you see a passage like Ecclesiastes 11:1. He says, cast thy bread upon the waters. So figuratively speaking, what he's saying is, you need to what God has given you. God has given you bread. Okay, good. Well, why don't you take that and you just cast it out there? And you see what God can do with it. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7, and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. And then what he does is he draws attention to the fact that there are just natural cycles to things. And he says, if the clouds be full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. If a tree falls toward the north or the south, in the place where the tree falls, there it shall be. And then he says, he that observeth the wind shall not sow, and he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap. And what he's talking about is this extremely careful man who's just unwilling to take any chance, unwilling to take any risk, makes up all the excuses in the world of like, I just don't know if I can do that. And he's saying, listen, as you know not the way of the Spirit, nor how the bones do grow in the womb of her that is with child, even so thou knowest not the work of God that maketh all. In the morning, sow thy seed. In the evening, withhold not thine hand. So in the early days where you're like, ooh, it's morning, I can do really a whole lot of work. I'm going to really be profitable here. He's saying, go ahead, go for it. And then as it gets toward nightfall, and you're like, I just don't know, like maybe I should save a little bit for tomorrow. He's like, no, withhold not thy hand. For thou knowest not whether shall prosper, or whether this or that, or whether they shall both be alike good. And he's looking at someone who's holding their hand back going, I just don't know. I don't know if I can, I don't know. And he's saying, take the chance and just go all in. If it comes to serving God, if it comes to serving others, go all in. Don't be this person who's like, well, I just. And then he says, in the morning sow thy seed, and he just goes through that. And he gets into some other points here. I can speak from experience. When I was in my 20s, which wasn't so long ago, I was at a missions conference. And the speaker was preaching on giving to God and giving to missionaries. And I was not rich, okay, but I didn't have a whole lot of expenses and I had a fairly good job. So I was able to set aside a good amount of money. And I was challenged to give to missionaries because my church didn't do much with missionaries. And so I was at this other church and I was like, I need to give. And so I had promised so much a month. And as I'm sitting there listening to the preaching, I kind of look at the number and I'm like, am I really sacrificing? Like, is this number really a sacrifice at all? Not really. And so God really challenged me and said, I want you to sacrifice. Like, I want this giving that you have promised to me, I want it to pinch a little bit. I want it to hurt, if I could use that expression. And so what I did is I started saying, okay, I'll raise that number, and I'll raise that number again, and I'll raise that number again. And I started doing the math of 12 months at that rate, and I was like, ooh, that's a big percentage. That hurts. I don't know that I can do that. And God convicted me about that because it's like, well, one, what else are you going to do with it? And two, why should you not take that risk? Why should you not give? And I felt really convicted, and I did. And God provided the money, and He provided the resources, and I gave. And I was glad to. It was a good experience for me. Now that I'm on the other side of things, and working as a missionary in California, raising my own support and all of that good stuff, can I tell you from experience, God has more than given that back to me. One of the coolest blessings I've received is I had 2 complete vans given to us in our last 5 or 6 years here in California. We had kids. We could no longer fit in the car. The car was starting, we didn't realize, but very soon after that, the car would die. And so we needed a van to fit all of our kids in. And so we simply asked on Facebook, hey, anybody know of a good van? And my wife's father was like, hey, actually, the school I work for is getting rid of a van. Let me look into it. They gave him the van for free. He's a mechanic, so he fixed it up. And then he and my mother-in-law drove it all the way from New Hampshire to California to drop it off. That's quite a delivery service. Yeah, really nice, Dad. And so I'm telling you, that was way more than what I had given in that missions offering, the value of that van. And because God likes to outdo Himself, it happened again last year. We needed a bigger van because we have more kids and they don't fit in the old van. And the old van was starting to fall apart because a few accidents happened and a window fell off. It happened. It was weird. And so what we were realizing is we needed an 8-passenger van to kind of grow into where our kids were. And so again, we asked on Facebook, we said, anybody know of a good place to buy an 8-passenger van? And we had some friend of ours in San Francisco who said, hey, we have a van. Okay, what do you want? You know, they're like, it's been sitting in our garage. It's been there since, COVID, and we just haven't been using it, so it's just been sitting. So we love for it to be used in ministry. And I was like, all right, okay, what do you want for it? And they're like, we'll give it to you. We're going to put a new battery in it. We're going to get it registered, and we're going to drive it up for you. I'm not saying that if you give in the missions offering that God is going to magically hand you a van. I don't know that you'd want our van anyway, but it's just luck. Yeah. But you see what I mean? It's the God working behind the scenes. And someone just happened to see the Facebook post. And they just happened to get the vehicle. And they just happened to have a family member who said, oh, sure, I'll buy you this, and you don't need it, so you're going to get... And that's why, as you look at a thing like this, I think being too careful is actually a distraction, because there's a level of lack of trust in that. We could go on with several other things. One here, Ecclesiastes 10, verse 4, brings up another one. Ecclesiastes 10, verse 4, I think arrogance can be a distraction. This one is a little trickier, but look at Ecclesiastes 10, verse 4. It says, if the spirit of a ruler rise up against thee, leave not thy place, for yielding pacifieth great offenses. And again, it's just a simple thing there just to remind us that there is a time and a place to be the brash, fighter. And sometimes that's arrogance. Verse 20 says, curse not the king, no, not in thy thought, and curse not the rich in thy bedchamber, for the bird of the air shall carry the voice, and that which hath wings shall tell the matter. And I just, for this one, I just remember as a teacher one time I was really frustrated with a student, and I was griping to another teacher about, this one student, and she's so bossy, and blah, 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 blah. And guess who randomly comes out of the classroom that I was standing in front of? That student. And then you have to say, that was wrong of me. And those are the type of things that he's reminding us of, that, what you say in your bedchamber, what you say in private just has a way of slipping out. So be careful. And it's a distraction, and it's a stumbling block. And so these are other things that form a distraction. And then to close this point, Ecclesiastes 10:17, I think conceit can be a distraction as well. And it says this, Ecclesiastes 10:17, blessed art thou, O land, when thy king is the son of nobles, and thy princes eat in due season for strength, and not for drunkenness. And this is a strange passage if you don't understand the context. But in the context of that day, a lot of court business was done in the morning. So if you have a ruler who is eating in the morning, and the eating is more than just having breakfast, it's a party lifestyle, it's kind of that, I'm just going to live for pleasure. And if you have a king or a ruler who's doing that in the morning when they're supposed to be doing work, that's really a curse. And so you think about the arrogance, you think about the conceitedness of someone who says, I can do whatever I want. And the distraction and the stumbling block that is. And so he says, again, verse 16, woe to thee, O land, when thy king is a child. And it's not saying a physical child, it's saying he acts like a child. And thy princes eat in the morning. And then he says, but blessed are you, O land, when thy king is the son of nobles, and thy princes eat in due season for strength, and not for drunkenness. And so there's all sorts of things that distract. There's all sorts of things that stumble. And so that's why we need to focus on God. That's why we need to focus on what God has asked of us, and focus on what God has given us, and those are the things. And so let's wrap it up. We've looked at a lot of Ecclesiastes. There's obviously tons of passages in there that we haven't gotten a chance to look at. But where is Solomon leading us? First of all, he's leading us to the end of the road. He's trying to draw attention to death and the end of the road that's coming, and challenging us to live right. He's trying to help us understand that God is in control over our situation. That leads into a look at all those distractions to say, don't let any of these drag you away. Keep God your focus. And that's where we go to where we started this morning, which is Ecclesiastes 12 and 13 and 14. And we'll just read it one more time, and then I'll take questions. But in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13 and 14, he wraps it all up, and he says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. So that concludes our study of Ecclesiastes for this session. I don't know if there are any questions or comments. If there's things that you have learned from Ecclesiastes, I'd love to hear them. But I do want to open it up, and if you have questions, I'll do my best to answer them from the book. So.
Just kind of talking about birthdays, as I was last night, I was thinking birthday and all that, and I was thinking, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And this is pretty much what you were talking about, and I just hope I will continue to glorify, that I will glorify the Lord in the rest. And I just appreciate you just really stressing that point. Death is, imminent sometimes, And so what are you going to do from now on until it happens, And I appreciate what you said. And my question is actually, Solomon obviously asked the Lord for wisdom, and, it wasn't at the end of his life, it wasn't quite there. The wisdom. And so when he asked the Lord for wisdom, did the Lord incorporate the end of his life to make him realize what wisdom was really all about? I don't know if it's clear.
So are you asking if God showed him the end of his life, or God just kind of gave him more wisdom at the end of his life?
Well, yeah, he gave him more wisdom at the end of his life, do you think?
It may have. The interesting thing with the book of Ecclesiastes is Solomon will keep saying throughout that my wisdom stayed with me.
Yeah.
So it seems.
That's what I meant.
So Ecclesiastes 7 is one of my favorite passages in Ecclesiastes. Comes out of Ecclesiastes 7:7, and it's surely oppression makes a wise man mad, and the language there is it makes him go a little bit insane in the head. I can explain why that is if you want to know, but just in the studies I've looked into, specifically the verse I look at is David when he pretends to be insane, when he goes down to the Philistines and he scrabbles at the door and drools on his beard. The very language used for what do I need, another madman? That's the same word. So that's why I take it to mean insane, not angry. So I think some of the things Solomon went through could have messed with his head, but specifically the last part of that verse says, "And a gift destroyeth the heart." You think about the power of a bribe, so to speak. You think about the power of a patron or some of that language. So how much of Solomon's wisdom remained with him throughout his life? He insists it did. But even the wisest man, he said, oppression makes you go a little bit insane. So I don't know how that played out throughout his life, whether he kept his good sanity. But he definitely went into idolatry, and he married, the Bible says, 700 wives and 300 concubines, and had idols to all of their gods, and he bowed down to those gods. And you're like, that does not sound like a wise move. Yet you have cases like Nebuchadnezzar, who was driven insane for 7 years, and then God gave him his sanity back. So I don't know if that happened with Solomon. I just don't think the text, if anyone else knows or can think of an illustration that would prove one way or another, I can't beyond that. So that's where I would go. I think his wisdom remained with him, but I think when the judgment started looming, he suddenly realized where he had done wrong. And that might have been the nail that was like, oh, okay, I missed that. Any other questions or comments relating to the text here? Yes? So extra biblical sources on Ecclesiastes or Solomon. I think there might be some apocryphal books that are credited to him, but I don't know if they really were written by him or not. In fact, there's a big argument back and forth on whether Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, and that's because some of the language seems a little bit out of place for that time period in history. The reason I still think it's Solomon is when it says it's Solomon, but Solomon would have been the one who used language that might not have been typical to Israel, because I mean, he's married to a lady from Egypt, and he's got, dealings with all these other countries. And there is some evidence that Solomon incorporated some Egyptian proverbs into his writings, because you compare Proverbs to some of the stuff coming out of Egypt, and you're like, that's almost the same proverb. Well, the Bible says he sought out and he set in order many proverbs, which means he's going to find wisdom from here and say, that actually is true. And he's gathered them and he put them together. So you have the writings of Proverbs, you have the writings of Song of Solomon, and you have the writings of Ecclesiastes. Someone pointed out, they said, if you look at those three books, you actually see Solomon at the different stages of his life. So Song of Solomon is him as a young man who's just absolutely head over heels in love. That's, yeah. Yeah, a similar style, but you can tell by the content, because Ecclesiastes is very obviously him at the end of his life, and Proverbs is him more or less talking to his children and saying, all right, here's some things you need to know. But I don't know of any other, I'm sure there was, God just chose not to preserve it for whatever reason. But I don't know the actual answer to whether we have anything that's lasted to today. Anything else? All right. Well, let's close in prayer, and then we will be dismissed.